Well, good morning, my friends. Welcome back to church as we continue our virtual journey that began about this time last year with COVID when we first heard of it and has continued through this year, much to our chagrin. But the podcasts are here, and I think they'll be here to stay. So those of you that are enjoying the podcast, hopefully that will be encouraging to you. Those of you who aren't enjoying the podcast probably aren't tuning in. So no hair off my back. All right. Well, let's get started this morning as we dive into Matthew chapter 14. I was thinking about, in light of this chapter of God's provision and God's providence, I was thinking about how, especially when I was a kid, how I loved to find money. I still love to find money. It just happens less frequently now that I'm a grown-up. But there really are a few things that are sweeter, especially when you're a kid, than it is just finding unexpected money. We had this actually happen to us just recently. Both of our girls needed their wisdom teeth taken out, and of course we had not really set aside money for oral surgery just on a whim, and we were going to need to dip into savings or find some way to pay for these wisdom teeth. And about the same time that the appointments were being made for the wisdom teeth, we got a refund from our escrow that was enough to cover the bill for both of our girls to get their wisdom teeth pulled. And I remember thinking at the time when we got that money, we should just sit on this because there's something that this needs to be used for that's coming up. We just don't know what that something is yet. Have you ever been in that situation before? Where you find money and you just know that it means there's something coming around the corner that God's preparing you for. I think that happens. I had a friend growing up, and Darren worked for his dad on the farm, and so he was one of the kids when we were young, when we were in elementary school and then later in junior high. He was one of the actually few kids in my school that actually had their own money. And so we were always kind of marveled that Darren always had money. And the reason Darren always had money was that he would when he would get paid, he would take the $20 bills that he would get paid and he would squirrel them away in his room, which was an absolute disaster most of the time. And then when he needed money, he would clean his room up and he would find enough money. He would keep cleaning until he found enough money to do whatever it is he wanted to do or go buy whatever it is he wanted to go buy. And then he'd stop cleaning. And so he'd always kind of partially clean his room up in order to find money. I'm not sure that counts as providence if you're just squirreling away money into your house and it's so messy that you can't find it again. But for us, that was kind of the junior high way of putting the credit card in the freezer in a block of ice. You know, you just couldn't get to it that easily because you couldn't just spend the money without having to go through the arduous process of cleaning your room. And who wants to do that when you're a junior high boy? Well, this morning we're going to get a look firsthand at God's providence in action as Jesus feeds the 5,000, and we see what questions that raises for us as we try to follow Jesus in 2021, as we highlight the providence of God and the compassion that Jesus Christ calls us to moving forward in this new day that we're in. Let's take a look at our scripture this morning. It comes from Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 13. And it says this: As soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. That evening the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "That isn't necessary. You feed them." "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here," he said. Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up towards heaven, and blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. Okay, let's dive right into this. It starts out by saying that as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. Well, what news would cause Jesus to want to go off and be by himself? Well, Matthew tells us just previously in chapter 14, John the Baptist has been beheaded, and the news has just reached Jesus as he's been out on the trail of ministry, as he's been doing his itinerant ministries around the area of Galilee. And so word gets to Jesus, and the first thing Jesus does is he wants to be alone. We can imagine the grief that's going on here. Have you been in a situation like that where you've lost someone or you've lost something so dear to you that you just want to be by yourself? You just don't want to be around people anymore? You just need to have the space to be able to grieve, the space to be able to let go? Well, Jesus doesn't get the space. He leaves seeking this space, this time to be alone, this time to process his feelings of grief. His feelings must have been compounded by the fact that could just as easily be him and will be shortly Jesus on a cross. Jesus is grieving and wants to be alone, but the people won't leave him alone, so he responds in his grief with compassion. Don't miss this. Jesus' response in the midst of his own personal grief is to look with compassion on the crowds that had gathered and do something. And in this case, Jesus begins to heal them, which draws more crowds and the people want to stick around. The danger of grief is that it can lock us down into a dark spiral. Showing compassion to others can help lift that darkness. There's a whole idea about self-compassion when it comes to grieving, and this idea of self-compassion that what we would say to someone in our situation is oftentimes not the things that we say to ourselves. Oftentimes when we're grieving, we're very hard on our own selves as we grieve, thinking we should be doing better, thinking we should be coping better, that we should be stronger than we are being, and that negative reinforcement doesn't do anything to help. Compassion is the thing. Self-compassion to start with, being able to give yourself a break, being able and willing to say the things to yourself that you would say to someone in your situation. And when you say those kinds of things to people that are grieving, you don't just go barging in like a bull in a china shop and tell them all the things that they're doing wrong in their grieving process. You listen and you grieve with them, and you show compassion and empathy as they grieve through whatever their grieving process looks like. So there's something to be said for compassionate grieving. But there's something to be said for compassion in grieving. That compassion is the ultimate outlet for grief. And we see this from Jesus. Sympathy looks in and says, I'm sorry. Compassion goes in and says, I'm with you. Sympathy looks in and says, I would like to help. Compassion goes in and says, I'm here to help. Sympathy says, I wish I could carry your burden. Compassion says, cast your burden on me. Sympathy often irritates with many words. Compassion helps and hears in quietness and understanding. There's a story I heard many times that illustrates the difference between sympathy and compassion and demonstrates the critical effect the act of compassion can have on another person's life. It seems that a young man named Mark was walking home from school one day when he noticed that a boy ahead of him had tripped and dropped all of the books he was carrying, along with 2 sweaters, a baseball hat, a glove, and a small tape recorder. Mark knelt and helped the boy pick up the scattered articles. Since they were going the same way, he helped the boy carry part of the burden. As they walked, he discovered the boy's name was Bill, that he loved video games, baseball, history, and that he was having lots of trouble with his other subjects. They arrived at Bill's home first, and Mark was invited in for a Coke and watched some television. The afternoon passed pleasantly with a few laughs and some shared small talk. Then Mark went home. They continued to see each other around school, had lunch together once in a while, then both graduated from junior high school. They ended up in the same high school where they had brief contacts over the years. Finally, the long-awaited senior year came, and 3 weeks before graduation, Bill asked Mark if they could talk. Bill reminded him of the day years ago when they had first met. Did you ever wonder why I was carrying so many things home that day? Asked Bill. You see, I cleaned out my locker because I didn't want to leave a mess for anyone else. I had stored away some of my mother's sleeping pills, and I was going to commit suicide. But after we spent time together, talking and laughing, I realized that I didn't want to die. I would have missed that time with you and many other good times in my life that followed. I'm trying to say, Mark, that you did a lot more when you picked up those books that day. You saved my life. Compassion is something you can develop with practice. It involves two things: intention and action. Intention is simply opening your heart to others, and action is what you need to do about it. Mark decided to open his heart to another person in need, and once he did that, he decided to help that person. It was a small gesture and only took a few moments for all that to happen, but that is how compassion works. As Mother Teresa reminds us, we cannot do great things on this earth. We can only do small things with great love. Imagine what would have happened if Mark had only shaken his head in sympathy and walked on. We never know what a difference we can make in someone's life when we show compassion. Jesus shows compassion to these crowds of people, these sick, needy people who are looking for him to heal them. They're lost, he says, like sheep without a shepherd. And rather than being angry that they've encroached on his quiet grieving time, rather than being defensive, he opens up his heart and shows compassion to them and begins to live an outpouring of compassion, of healing, right there in their midst, right there in the middle of nowhere, as the crowds begin to gather more and more and more. Jesus' compassion is infectious. I want to give the disciples the benefit of the doubt here. When they tell Jesus to send the crowds away to go buy food, I'm thinking that they're trying to get on board with this infectious compassion of Jesus. Either that, or it's the opposite. They've just had their fill of the day and they're ready to call it. And they want Jesus to end this so that they can get some peace and quiet. We don't really know what the disciples are thinking, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. That what happened, because this often happens, is that when people saw Jesus being so compassionate, it inspired the compassion in them. And so they began to think about how hungry people were getting, and maybe they heard some grumbling from people about how late it was getting, and decided to act, to intervene, and to bring this to Jesus' attention, as he obviously hasn't been paying close enough attention to the needs of his people, right? So they think, send them away for food to the nearby villages where they can buy food, because this is kind of a desolate place where they're at. Yes, that's a great idea. Except for it isn't a great idea. It's a terrible idea. With this many people, this crowd outnumbers any nearby village. This crowd is larger than the crowd of the entire population of Capernaum, the largest city in Galilee, in the village in that area. And this is a desolate, outlying place. This is a terrible idea, but it's the best that the disciples can come up with. Now, Matthew makes note here to address the fact that there are 5,000 men there, not counting the women and children. In biblical times, they often didn't count women and children as part of the group, and so to get an idea of 5,000 men, we have to understand that there would be with them their families, a lot of them, and so you have to take into account the women and children that are there too. This crowd would number between 15 to 20,000 people by all estimates. It reminds me of when we have concerts at the Gorge Amphitheater right down the road here from where we live. When I was working down there for a little extra money in the summer, it was phenomenal because we would have crowds of 20, 21, 22, 25,000 people, and instantly create in just the campground one of the largest cities in all of Grant County, just out in the middle of nowhere, putting a strain on all of the businesses and the economy and the people in George and Quincy and the surrounding areas. So you can imagine the swell and the size of this crowd, and how impossible a feat this would be for them to go and buy food. There would have been no villages that would have made that much leftover food, that they would have had any food to buy. But this is the best plan the disciples can come up with. And notice they don't tell Jesus just to send the people home. He says just send them to get food so they can keep the party going. There doesn't appear to be any inkling here that the disciples are ready to move on. In fact, you can imagine this might have seemed like an incredible blessing. The idea that they could stop their itinerant ministry and the people would just come to them in droves, that the food and shelter wouldn't be an issue because Jesus could provide the food. People could bring their own shelters, and they could have a makeshift camp set up. This would have seemed, I'm sure, very appealing rather than always being homeless, on the move, and dependent on the hospitality of others. So the disciples don't send the people away, they just want to send them to go get food. So Jesus does what only Jesus can do. He turns the disciples' suggestions on its ear by asking them to feed the crowd. Now, one of the first things we learn about compassion is that compassion involves action, and that often involves sacrifice. Somebody here had to sacrifice their dinner to this rabbi, and we think, this is the disciples say, this is all we have, are these 5 loaves and 2 fishes. It's all the food the disciples have, which isn't enough to feed 12 disciples. It's certainly not enough to feed 15 to 20,000 people. But the first thing that has to occur for compassion to take root and for this miracle to take place is somebody has to offer what they had to eat as a sacrifice. Clarence Stevens tells a story. He says, leaving a store, I returned to my car only to find I'd locked my keys and my cell phone inside. A teenager riding his bike saw me kick a tire and say a few choice words. What's wrong, he asked. I explained my situation. But even if I could call my wife, I said, she can't bring me her car keys since this is our only car. He handed me his cell phone. Call your wife and tell her I'm coming to get her key. That's a 7-mile round trip. Don't worry about it. An hour later, he returned with the key. I offered him some money, but he refused. Let's just say I needed the exercise, he said. Then, like a cowboy in the movies, he rode off into the sunset. The disciples weren't in any position to feed so many people. They didn't even have enough to feed themselves, and yet Jesus asked them to sacrifice what they do have to do something miraculous. This isn't the first time we've seen this kind of miracle. Matthew is framing Jesus as a kind of new Moses to the Jewish mind, and we're reminded of God's provision of manna in the desert. These are Jewish people. They know their history of God providing in lonely, desolate places and in times when there wasn't enough. And yet they don't jump to that as their first idea. They don't ask Jesus to do something he's not ready or willing to do. They're just willing to sacrifice what they have and begin to be a part of something miraculous. And that's what it's really all about. When we sacrifice something that we have so that we can be a part of something larger, a larger work in someone else's life. That's what it's really all about. Once again, we have a huge crowd of hungry and lost people in the desert, and God will provide the manna that they need, but this time he's going to use what his disciples have to do it. Now, the disciples should have immediately been reminded of the prophet Elisha and the way that God provided miraculously in the past. In 2 Kings chapter 4, it says, one day a man from Baal Shalisha brought the man of God, so Elisha, a sack of fresh grain and 20 loaves of barley bread made from the first grain of his harvest. Elisha said, give it to the people so they can eat. What? His servant exclaimed. Feed 100 people with only this? But Elisha repeated, give it to the people so they can eat, for this is what the Lord says. Everyone will eat, and there will even be some left over. And when they gave it to the people, there was plenty for all, and some left over, just as the Lord had promised. Sound familiar? Yeah. This again is Jesus showing the fact that when he talks and when he does things and when he moves with compassion, you're hearing the voice of God. You're seeing the compassionate heart of God through Jesus Christ. I wonder if people can see that in us. Can they see the compassionate heart of Jesus in us? Or do they only see our exterior Christianity? Those things that we allow people to see, or those things that we pride ourselves on. Our hallmark, our namesake, our name tag should be compassion. It's that act of actively participating in the life of another in love and empathy. It moves just beyond sympathy. But with this, we're kind of like the disciples, aren't we? We ignore the past as we struggle with the present. We forget how God has provided for us in the past, where he's met us in our deepest need, and we stand confounded in our current predicament. Do we trust God to be enough for our needs? Do we trust his providence? Whether those needs are physical or spiritual or emotional needs, are we trusting God to provide for our needs? That's a good question. Like the disciples, we can't see a good solution to the problem at hand, but Jesus' answer to the problem is always what God can and will do through your compassion. That's always the answer, what God can do through our compassion. As that synergy of God living and moving in his kingdom among us and through us and with us happens, Compassion is the verb that we live. Best-selling leadership author Stephen Covey tells the following story about an incident he experienced in the New York subway system, an experience that would radically alter his perception of what is often happening behind the scenes of our lives. I remember a mini paradigm shift I experienced one Sunday morning on a subway in New York. People were sitting quietly, some reading newspapers, some lost in thought, some resting with their eyes closed. It was a calm, peaceful scene. Then suddenly, a man and his children entered the subway car. The children were so loud and rambunctious that instantly the whole climate changed. The man sat down next to me and closed his eyes, apparently oblivious to the situation. The children were yelling back and forth, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. It was very disturbing. And yet, the man sitting next to me did nothing. It was difficult not to feel irritated. I could not believe that he could be so insensitive as to let his children run wild like that and do nothing about it, taking no responsibility at all. It was easy to see what everyone else on the subway that everyone else on the subway felt irritated too. So finally, with what I felt like was unusual patience and restraint, I turned to him and said, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more." The man lifted his gaze as if to come to a consciousness of the situation for the first time and said softly, "Oh, you're right. I guess I should do something about it. We just came from the hospital where their mother died about an hour ago. I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Can you imagine what I felt at that moment? My paradigm shifted. Suddenly I saw things differently, and because I saw differently, I thought differently. I felt differently. I behaved differently. My irritation vanished. I didn't have to worry about controlling my attitude or my behavior. My heart was filled with the man's pain. Feelings of sympathy and compassion flowed freely. "Your wife just died? Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me about it? What can I do to help?" Everything changed in that instant. I think we need a paradigm shift. I know I do. Too many times I rationalize or justify why my participation, why my compassion, why my sacrifice is unnecessary. When in reality, all I'm doing is missing out on the miraculous works that God's trying to do through my little sacrifice of compassion. Friends, let's let compassion be the hallmark of who we are. Even if it gets wearying at times, even if there's times we want to send the crowds away, send them home, there's a time and a place for that. Jesus is going to continue in chapter 14, and the very next thing he's going to do is he's going to send the crowds away, just like the disciples had asked, but he's going to send them away for good. I imagine the most industrious people were already figuring out how they could repeat this and streamline this into more of an industrious kind of setup where Jesus wouldn't have to travel and people could come to him and miracles could just be central in one location. Like a free hospital with free meals included. But Jesus shuts the door on that thinking when he tells the crowd to go home. And yet, in just another chapter, he's going to do the same miracle all over again to another crowd that is sick and tired and in need of someone to intervene with compassion. So this morning, I guess my question are, what are your loaves and fish? Compassion doesn't always come easily to some of us. It can be a struggle to be empathetic, to put yourself in someone else's shoes and try and feel what they're feeling, to understand their situation from where they're coming from. I find it's easier to show compassion when we envision the other person as Jesus. What wouldn't we do for Jesus, right? And yet that list grows very short when it comes to the things that we're willing to sacrifice and do for other people. We have limits, we have rules, we've been burned before when we've been compassionate. We've learned to guard ourselves and guard our hearts. Christians should be known for our compassion. We should let it become our aroma. Allow Jesus to help. Allow Jesus to involve you in helping someone else, and you will be richer for it. Amen. So the song for this week is Build My Life. because I need Jesus to build my life into one of being a compassionate disciple, a compassionate follower. Not just somebody who believes the right stuff in my head, but somebody who lives it out in my everyday life. Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. You open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. You open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Amen. Have a wonderful Lord's Day. I love you. God bless you.